Good evening. Welcome to the final installment of our fall native plant school classes. Hopefully you were part of the first three classes last week, and then last Tuesday with Katie on shade gardening. If you were not part of those, we will be making those available after the fall plant sale in a couple weeks. My name is Scott Vogt. I'm the director here at the Arboretum. We've had tremendous interest in these classes, and today's class, Trees and Shrubs for Habitat Gardens, is no exception. Again, as in the other presentations, if you have questions, submit those by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Trees and Shrubs for Habitat Gardens. As I was thinking about this class and this topic, over the last several weeks, I was trying to think of examples to share with you about what trees and shrubs and how they create habitat. And one of the best examples that we have here in the Arboretum is our birdwatch area in the southwest part of the Arboretum. It's in the corner, surrounded on two sides by a hedgerow. There's large canopy trees, there's flowering shrubs and small understory trees that bloom. And then there's also a ground cover layer of wildflowers and grasses. And so within this birdwatch area, you have different layers or tiers within the landscape that provide protection, provide food, protection from the wind, from the elements, and there's also a water source going through this area. So it has all of the elements that are needed for survival of wildlife, whether it's birds or even pollinators that are utilizing the blooms that are there. So as you think about your own landscape and what trees and shrubs to include, I think it's really important to think of these tiers. So you have the canopy, the larger trees, you kind of have the understory trees that provide seasonal bloom, and then you have groupings of wildflowers and grasses in areas that, still get some sunlight and provide food and nectar sources for a lot of the bees and butterflies. And so this is good for not only for birds, but it's good for the pollinators, these tiers or these different levels within the landscape. So as you think about your own, landscape, one of the things that kind of drives this point home is there's certain aspects of a forest and certain plants within a forest that are associated with different kinds of butterflies, different kinds of insects. And you can see there on the left, the forest attracts and is host for butterflies such as zebra swallowtail, which we've seen here at the Arboretum because we have pawpaw trees, spicebush swallowtail, pipevine swallowtail. All of those are associated with the forest. And then you have some of the field which are associated with the prairie. And the gist of this is that if you have both the forest with the trees and shrubs, and then also a representation of some kind of prairie planting, and it doesn't have to be extremely elaborate, but the more diversity that you have, the better, the more wildlife that you're going to come in contact with, and it's what's going to be attracted to your yard. So think of diversity, not just planting all oaks, but planting lots of different kinds of trees and shrubs within your landscape to increase the diversity that is attracted to your area. So something else that maybe help you guide some of the decisions that you make as you're choosing plant material, especially associated with some of the larger canopy trees, is from Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. He did a study and found that 534 different species of moths and butterflies are associated with the oak family, the Quercus family. You can see black cherry and on down the list. And you can see the landscape value, the wildlife attraction that is associated with each of these trees. And so, again, diversity is the key. Not all oaks, don't plant all oaks, but plant oaks and black cherry and a few elms and a few basswood trees. And by increasing that diversity, you will also increase the amount of species that are supported within your landscape. For instance, he did a study and it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in a season to raise a brood of 5 chickadees. So you think of the chickadees, and they're going to these oak trees, and they're going to these black cherry trees, and they're finding these larvae and caterpillars and taking those back to the little hatchlings. And it takes 6,000 to 9,000. So these trees can be a tremendous food source for wildlife, particularly some of these songbirds that rely on them throughout the growing season. So diversity is the key with regards to choosing the amount of species or the types of species that you want to include in your yard. So we're going to go through these relatively fast. These are just in list form. I'll talk briefly about them, but these are some of the plants that I would try to include within the landscape and provide habitat, food sources, both as pollinators and as the food that wildlife needs. The first one here is Prunus serratina. It's one that's overlooked. I'm not as familiar with this one, but it's one that we started to sell over the last several years within our plant sale, and it has beautiful fragrant blooms in the springtime, clusters of fruit that the birds love, but the pollinators just flock to this in the spring when these white fragrant blooms are covering the tree. It has good fall color, gets 30 to 40 feet tall, and 30 to 40 feet in spread. But it's a nice tree for the landscape, should be utilized more. One of these would be sufficient because of the quantity of fruit that they produce, each tree produces, but should be included. Maybe in a peripheral area. It's not as majestic, but it certainly adds a lot of different aspects that are attracted to a lot of different species of wildlife, and we'll bring those to your yard. Different kinds of elms. Elms get a bad rap because of the Siberian elms, which are prolific, that seed everywhere, and we've lost some of the majesty because the American elm was decimated by Dutch elm disease many years ago. But there are species that are being selected that are resistant to Dutch elm disease and have shown resistance. And these are forms that could be utilized within the landscape. Valley Forge, New Harmony, Princeton, Lewis and Clark. These are good selections, good varieties that show good resistance to Dutch elm disease. This is a stately tree that gets rather large, can get 70, 80 feet high and probably equal spread. So a rounded appearance and very resistance to some breakage during ice storms. But this is one that should be utilized more. Kind of forgotten because of Dutch elm disease, but elms are good for a lot of different reasons. Most of them have decent fall color then too. Prairie gold aspen, we started growing this here at the Arboretum probably 10 to 15 years ago. Original plants were discovered in central Nebraska, growing in the middle of a prairie. This is so it's more drought tolerant, more adapted to our region. And good fall color, rapid growth. You can get 3 to 4 feet of growth in one season, and a good habitat plant as well. I love the white bark on this. One thing I will say about quaking aspen in our experience is that it does have a tendency to sucker and spread, form thickets. So you wouldn't want to plant this next to a formal garden, but naturally it spreads by underground runners and forms kind of naturalizes an area over time. But still beautiful in forming those colonies. Sycamore tree, I love the exfoliating bark of this. It's one of my favorite trees because many years ago I saw a large specimen tree along the Cottonwood River. It's probably 70, 80 feet wide, equal in height, but it had beautiful white, green exfoliating bark, very striking and very majestic tree. Our native sycamore is susceptible to anthracnose, so a good alternative is the variety called Bloodgood. It's a kind of a hybrid cross. Doesn't get as large, but still has that attractive exfoliating bark. So red oaks, these are some varieties that I think would grow well here in south central Kansas. Red oak is one that we have here at the Arboretum. We've also more recently started growing a variety called Shumard oak, Quercus shumardii. It's more drought tolerant, still has a great fall color, but is a little bit more adapted to our climate. Gets 60 to 80 feet tall and 40 to 50 feet wide, so it's more rounded or oval rounded when it's mature. But of the red oaks that are available, Shumard is probably one of the better ones for our area here in south central Kansas. Bur oaks, there's large ones here just outside of Heston that are probably 100, 120 feet wide and spread. Branches are 2 to 3 feet in diameter, so they can get rather large. So you want to give these bur oaks plenty of space, plenty of room to grow. But they're excellent for food, because the acorns that they produce, the larvae eat on the twigs and the buds and the leaves, again, that are good for attracting birds, bringing birds into your yard. And then, of course, the squirrels love those large acorns as well. But these can be, these are long-lived trees, but they need plenty of space. Certainly, these are the more upper canopy, larger canopy trees within the landscape. White oak, I love white oaks. I love the white bark that it has. The fruit of the acorn is more of a sweeter, and it's preferred over some of the other acorns that are produced by the oaks, different kinds of oaks, but has more of a consistent fall color. I've seen reds and purples, but it's not as fast growing as the bur oak. Bur oaks can grow 12 to 18 inches in a year, whereas white oaks are more slow growing, maybe 6 to 8 inches in a year. But again, they'll get rather large if they like where they're growing, can get 60, 70 feet high and equal spread. So they can get large. Again, very good canopy tree, long-lived within the landscape. River birch. We have some of these in our parking lot, which is not the best place for them. As the name says, river, they need consistently moist soil. You see these oftentimes in the front yards, in people's front yards. Not the most ideal place for a river birch. But I love the exfoliating bark, but where they need to be is an area that stays more consistently moist, next to a stream, a low area in your yard, places they can even take some standing water, periodic standing water, but don't place them in an area where they're going to get dry. If they do start to get dry, they will drop their leaves, which often happens to ours here in the parking lot. But need consistently moist soil, but great for exfoliating bark and that bright green leaves that they produce. American linden. There's varieties of American linden. One of the most popular or most common ones is Redmond. Whether it's the American linden or the little leaf linden, what attracts these are great at attracting pollinators because the blooms, the fragrant blooms, will just actually stop you in your tracks because it is so pungent, so sweet smelling. And when these are in bloom, they're just humming with activities from bees, butterflies that are working on those intensely fragrant flowers. But American linden can get, 100 feet tall, very quick growing, 2 to 3 feet in a year, and kind of produces nice heart-shaped leaves that have a nice golden yellow fall color. Different kinds of maples. Some of my favorites are listed here: Bonfire, Green Mountain, Legacy. The ones that we've been planting more recently here at the Arboretum are John Pear and Autumn Splendor. They're varieties of Caddo sugar maples. They have good drought tolerance. They are tatter resistant with their leaves, and produce excellent fall color. John Pear has more of a reddish fall color, whereas Autumn Splendor has colors of reds, oranges, and yellows. But if you can find varieties of Caddo sugar maples, and there's more and more of those being produced or coming on the market all the time, those would be the types of sugar maples that I would prefer, that I would plant, because of they're a little bit more drought tolerant and hardy for our environment. They're called Caddo sugar maples because the original seed was collected in Caddo County, Oklahoma. So you know that if they can survive in the heat of Oklahoma, in the drought, they're going to be drought tolerant and tough. So if you're looking for sugar maples, look for Caddo sugar maples, the varieties John Pear, Autumn Splendor. Redbuds, this is more of an understory tree. I love the pink blooms. If you drive the turnpike or along the interstate in the spring, these plants really stand out in the landscape because of those vibrant pink blooms. There's lots of great name varieties. Appalachian Red, Forest Pansy is a purple leaf form, still has the pinkish blooms. Alba obviously has white blooms. And then Oklahoma, which is more heat resistant. But you can find these name varieties, or you can just grow the straight species. Great as an understory tree. Kind of nondescript when it's not in bloom, but a plant that grows best with the as an understory tree, kind of under the canopy of some of those larger, say, oak trees or cottonwoods. Black walnut, not the most ornamental tree, but it's on the list there that I showed you earlier that Dick Tallamy was highlighting. It is one that you have trouble growing other wildflowers, grasses under, because the toxicity of the soil, because of the substance that the roots exude. But still a great one for attracting lots of different insects, as a host for a lot of different insects, and then those nuts that wildlife use later on once they start dropping onto the ground. Black walnut is used for wood, commonly in eastern Kansas. There's even some groves here in south central Kansas. Become larger trees, but again, it's one that you want to plant maybe in the peripheral areas of your landscape, similar to the black cherry, but you wouldn't want to eliminate it from your plant palette because of the landscape or the wildlife attraction that happens because of black walnut. Black willow, obviously you don't find this along streams, wetter areas, but willow trees, the Salix nigra varieties are great for wetter areas. We have some here along our pond. They're not usually a landscape tree, but because of the wildlife that they attract, again, the butterflies and the moths species that these attract, it may be something that you want to consider and include these within your landscape. Cottonwood tree, these are obviously the state tree of Kansas. Good fall color, fast growing. See these along riparian areas, wetter areas. There's male and female forms. I've tried to grow the male forms, which don't produce the cotton that flies everywhere, but I've just found that they're not as long-lived. We have several here at the Arboretum, and ones that we've collected seed from, and so far they are male forms, but they are ones that would attract different kinds of pollinators and larvae that chew on the leaves. But beautiful, stately tree that can get rather large. We have some next to our pond, but like the river birch and the black willow, it'd be something that you'd want to include in a riparian area that stays relatively moist. Crabapple trees, we have a lot of these here at the Arboretum, and the thing that's most important with regards to crabapple trees is making sure that you choose disease-resistant varieties, whether resistant to scab, cedar apple rust, mildew, fire blight. There's great information on the internet about which varieties, but you want to make sure that you choose varieties that are good to excellent, that show good to excellent resistance to these diseases. Ones that are not resistant can damage the fruit, can totally defoliate, but there are great varieties. One that we have here that I'm really happy with is Prairie Fire, but there's lots of other good forms out there as well. So some shrubs that are good options for you within the landscape are dogwoods. Dogwoods all have this characteristic. You can see this leaf that's kind of pulled apart, these the fibers that intersect or connect the veins together. All dogwoods have this characteristic. Some of our native dogwoods, silky dogwoods, rough leaf dogwoods, gray dogwoods, all of those have nice blooms in the springtime, produce fruit, decent fall color. Some are taller forms, some form thickets. Kind of have to do some research on those, but you can see the fruit here that birds really, really love. The other thing to think about is these have a tendency to naturalize or sucker and spread, and so you want to give these, make sure you give some space to these. Great for erosion control too, but lots of different forms and that you can choose from, but all produce good flowers that pollinators like, and then fruit that birds will eat later in the season. Here's just some name varieties: the Kuzan, the Harzam, Huron. Those are great dogwood varieties. Red Rover is a silky dogwood variety that we've carried at our plant sale. Again, all of these will have great white blooms in the spring, and then good fruit production later in the summer. Vernal witch hazel. This blooms here at the Arboretum in February. Pollinators like it. Good fall color. Good filler plant that can get 8 to 10 feet tall, 6 to 8 feet wide. But I love these kind of frilly blooms at a time when nothing else is blooming, kind of a stark landscape, and then you see these vibrant yellow blooms of the vernal witch hazel. Another form is Virginia witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. That blooms more in the fall, and that may be another variety to consider. Smooth sumac, pollinators love the blooms, excellent fall color, lots of different forms and textures. This is smooth sumac. Aromatic sumac is another form. The smooth sumac produces those clusters of red fruit that are eaten by wildlife. But aromatic sumac produces nice clusters of blooms that pollinators like too. More of a thicket forming plant. You see some of those red forms, those thicket forming sumac in the fall with the blood red fall color. All of those are more for naturalizing areas. I wouldn't put these in a formal landscape, but they are great if you have some space and want to have some sumac because of the fall color that they produce. Coralberry buckbrush produces these kind of reddish fruit. There's all sorts of forms out there, berry heavy or proudberry, and they are great for kind of as a ground cover for semi-shaded areas. Birds love the fruit that they produce, and they're great at stabilizing the soil. Can grow 3 to 4 feet high, but oftentimes you see these as more of an understory, kind of filling in an area along a riverbank, stabilizing the soil, but varieties that spread quickly but should be utilized more. You can see the variety Proudberry is one that produces lots and lots of blooms around the stem of the plant. American Beautyberry, kind of whitish blooms in the summer months, and then you can see these bright purple blooms that cluster around the stem. Again, more of an understory tree, a shrub that only gets 2 to 3 feet tall by 2 to 3 feet wide. Treat it almost like a perennial because it blooms on new growth, so you can cut it back in the springtime, and then it'll expand and grow and get the same height as it did the previous year. So one that should be utilized more because of the fruit that produce, but kind of overlooked because it's kind of nondescript in the landscape for most of the season until these clusters of fruit emerge, usually in September and October. Dwarf sand cherry, any of the sand cherries, Prunus family, Prunus virginiana, this is variety Prunus besseyi. White blooms in the springtime, excellent fall color, produces kind of a purplish fruit that birds love. Pollinators obviously love the fragrant blooms, clusters of blooms in the springtime, but can get 18 to 24 inches tall and 4 to 5 feet in spread. So it's more almost like a shorter ground cover type plant. Clove currant, when these are in bloom in the springtime here at the Arboretum, they'll stop you in your tracks because that kind of spicy, clovey scent of the blooms is really, I don't know how to describe it. It is very fragrant, very unusual fragrance, but pollinators like it. Produces kind of purplish fruit in the summer months, and then has kind of a yellowish fall color. You see these a lot of times in hedgerows here in south central Kansas as understories, so you know if they can grow underneath a hedgerow, they are very hardy and tough and very adaptable to a lot of different extreme conditions. Some of our native viburnums should be utilized more. Two that are native to Kansas. Black Hall viburnum has kind of a smooth foliage, white blooms in the springtime, produces nice clusters of fruit. Here you see some specimen plants that we have up by the front along Hickory Street here at the Arboretum. Those long clusters of fruit that birds love, and then great fall color as well in late September and into October. Rusty Black Hall viburnum has more of a glossy foliage that turns purple in the fall. Still white blooms that pollinators love, clusters of fruit like little prunes that birds will devour later on in the winter months. Gets 15 to 18 feet tall and equal spread. Both the Black Hall and Rusty Black Hall have a tendency to form thickets, but you can train both of them to be kind of smaller understory trees in the landscape. Deciduous holly, I noticed today that our deciduous holly, a variety called Warren's Red. The fruit's starting to change, but these are great. The birds will leave these alone until the first snowfall that we have, and then they will clean these trees off in a matter of a couple days. They're not the most. They're not the fruit that birds look for the most or first, but they are. They do provide food, and birds will eat them in the harshest part of the winter months. So it's a very persistent fruit, so it looks attractive well into the winter. Buttonbush, Cephalanthus. This is a shrub that is often overlooked. The variety that we sell here at our plant sale, Sugar Shack, has this kind of Sputnik type bloom, psychedelic bloom. I've seen 15 to 20 swallowtail butterflies on one of our plants when it's in bloom in the summer months. Great for attracting lots of different pollinators, but it seems like swallowtail butterflies really like this plant as well. Likes to have its feet wet. You see it growing along ponds, ditches, areas that stay relatively moist, but it's fairly adaptable. We have one of these growing up in one of our flower beds, and it does fine, but Sugar Shack is a more shorter, more compact form of buttonbush. Blooms during the summer months as well. So a few evergreens that I want to highlight. Eastern red cedar, of course, it's our only native evergreen to the state of Kansas. Kind of gets a bad rap, but has tremendous wildlife habitat because of its foliage, because of the fruit that it produces. You can see there the clusters of fruit that the birds will devour. But it also provides shelter during the winter months for some of those birds that are overwintering here. Variety that you should look at, a couple of varieties that you should look at with regards to Eastern red cedar that give it a little more of a formal look, or canartii. Kind of has arms that protrude out, dark green foliage, and persistent fruit. And a more columnar or narrow formal form that is called Taylor juniper, 25 feet tall and only 3 to 4 feet wide. And we have several of these along the north side of our gardens here. And we've been really happy with their growth rate. Obviously, one of the drawbacks is that they are susceptible to bagworms, which we experienced here this year. But as far as evergreens go, you can't beat them for their adaptability and hardiness. There's the picture of the Taylor junipers. So it gives it more of a formal look overall. Bald cypress. I'll show you a picture at the end here of our native bald cypress. Do best again in areas that are consistently moist, relatively fast growing. It's a deciduous conifer, but you can see here it's starting to turn its fall color, kind of this russet red, but then it also produces knees right next to these wetter areas. Fast growing, but one that could be used within the landscape a little bit more, especially in areas that stay consistently moist. There's just a more upright, straight up version of called Shawnee Brave. Arizona cypress, we've been using these recently because of the loss of some of the other 2- and 3-needle pines, such as Scotch pine, that we've lost over the last 15 or 20 years here at the Arboretum, replacing some of those with this Arizona cypress, Cypressus arizonica. Gray-green foliage, it's very fragrant in the heat of the day, fast-growing, drought-tolerant, but it's a nice replacement for if you don't want to put junipers within the landscape. Lacebark pine, exfoliating bark, Relatively fast growing, about a foot a year, Pinus bungiana. As noted in that table at the beginning, any of these pines are great for the butterflies and moths that they attract. But this has an added bonus. It's relatively fast growing and has nice exfoliating bark. Pinyon pine, pretty drought tolerant. You wouldn't want to plant this as an area that's going to stay moist. It's one that prefers it to be a little bit on the drier side, and but relatively fast growing. Again, 8 to 12 inches in growth a year, and ultimately getting 20 to 25 feet tall. Black Hill spruce. As far as spruces go, this is one of the more drought tolerant ones. We have several of these planted throughout the Arboretum. Been really happy with how they've grown. We'll ultimately get 20, 25 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, and 2 to 3 or 10 to 15 feet in spread. So they're more of a pyramid shape, but they do form a nice windbreak if you have these grouped together. As in all of these pines, kind of these shorter needle pines and spruce trees, they are also susceptible to bagworms, so it's something that you need to be aware of when you're planting just about any evergreen here in south central Kansas. But we have seen bagworms on these, and they can quickly decimate them if you don't stay on top of them. But Black Hill spruce is a nice tree that should be utilized a little bit more than it is. Vanderwolf pyramid pine. I put this in here. It's a two needle pine. Another good one is southwestern white pine. It's a 5 needle pine. We've grown Vanderwolf. We've also lost a Vanderwolf because of tip blight. But this is a nice form. It has a kind of that whitish cast to the needles. Southwestern white pine is one that we prefer even over this because it seems to be a little bit hardier, more drought tolerant. But Vanderwolf is a nice option too. So that's kind of a list and grouping of plants that highlight and give you some diversity within your landscape. I encourage you to look at these. There's other forms that are available. A good resource to take advantage of is if you just do a search of recommended trees for south central Kansas. The Kansas Forestry Service has put together lists of very large, medium, and more understory trees, and even listing of recommended evergreen trees. It's a great list to look at. Gives the ultimate height of those plants, fall color, where they prefer to grow, but recommended trees of south central Kansas. So this is the end of the program, and look forward to answering your questions. Thanks for being part of these classes. All right, good evening. Can everybody hear me? So we'll just go through some of these questions that I have here. And if you have more, feel free to begin to type those in. So far, there's just a couple questions, but the first one here is, we're losing a lot of sycamore and London plane trees to iron chlorosis in my southwestern Kansas town, like silver maples. Have you seen this anywhere else in the state, mostly the plane trees? We have London plane trees here at the Arboretum. I haven't noticed any iron chlorosis, Chris. That doesn't mean that it won't develop down the road, but I haven't noticed that being a problem here. Iron chlorosis, mainly for us here in south central Kansas, has to deal with our pin oaks. And we've treated those with injections. We've dug holes and tried to treat the soil and change the pH. And that's worked for a couple years, but it's something that you're going to have to do continually. So my best advice would be, begin to replace those with other varieties that are that don't have the same problem of iron chlorosis as the plain trees do. Things like maples, like the Caddo sugar maple, may be a good option for you. Bur oaks, a pretty hardy tree, but yeah, that's unfortunate because those London plane trees, especially if they're of any size, can be really, really attractive. So, but you can treat them, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to keep those from developing iron chlorosis. Are cedars very thirsty, meaning that they need a lot of water? No, they're pretty drought tolerant, actually. You see cedars growing out in pastures, even in sandy soils, like the Sandhills prairies around Hutchinson, and they're pretty adaptable to a lot of conditions. But like anything, if they go through prolonged periods of drought, I have seen them die, but like in the years of 2011, 2012, there was some cedars that died just because they got too dry. But there was a lot of tree damage during those years. Years ago, Gloria asked, years ago I was told that a cottonless cottonwood male was a cross between a poplar and a cottonwood. Is that true? I don't believe so. But it just seemed like the ones that we had here, and when I first started here, we had 3 of them, and they just got decimated over the years with borers, all sorts of insect problems, and ultimately was their demise. But that may be the case. I think that they were true cottonwoods by the way that they looked, but they just didn't produce the cotton of the female forms. But yeah, there's better just the true cottonwood that you would get out of a pasture or something would be better than those male forms. They just seem to be hardier and more adapted to our climate. You mentioned a plant sale. When is that normally held? So our fall plant sale is coming up here for members on September 10. If you're a member, as of this past Monday, August 31st, you could start putting orders in too if you wanted to do that. But there's a form online that you can go to on our website. And then you can purchase plants there, or you can come in person to our member sale on the 10th, or to the general public sale the 11th through the 13th of September. How do I get shrubs to produce fruit such as service berries or viburnum? So typically with viburnums, such as like Viburnum prunifolium or Viburnum refigilum, you need 2 unique varieties, so not the same clone of Viburnum prunifolium, in order for them to produce produce fruit. Same thing with service berries. So you would need to have 2 different Viburnum prunifoliums in order for those to produce fruit. Same thing with some of the other varieties like Viburnum dentatum. There's different forms. You wouldn't want to plant all blue muffin. You'd want to plant some other varieties of Viburnum dentatum in order for those blue muffin, for instance, to produce fruit. We live in Council Grove and just moved to a part of town where the soil right underneath the grass is almost solid gravel. What type of tree might grow in such a challenging environment? There are some cedars almost totally eaten by bagworms, and cottonwoods in the immediate area. I think any of the oaks, I think that some of those Caddo sugar maples would be good choices for that area. But I think that you would need to maybe do some digging to make sure that it isn't through the whole soil profile, that they can have some actual soil that they attach to. But you know, there are some places where it's pretty gravelly, but I think there's some varieties that would work, such as, like I said, the oaks and those Caddo sugar maples would be ones that I would start with first. I have really like fragrant sumac and native elderberries. Do you sell either of those at the plant sale? Yes, we sell the fragrant sumac, a variety called Grow Low sumac, and both the York and Adams elderberries are two forms of elderberries that we have at the sale. What is your thoughts on Kentucky coffee tree? I think it's a wonderful tree. I think that the pods that they produce are wonderful. I had it originally in here and I took it out of my presentation just for time's sake, but it is a nice tree for the landscape. It's more open until it gets some age on it, and then it becomes more of a shade tree. So it takes probably 15 or 20 years to get a nice, deeper shade, larger tree of Kentucky coffee tree. Do you see the Prunus serratinus seeding through bird castings along fence lines and other roosting areas? I think it's a possibility. Several people have tried this. We don't have these here at the Arboretum. Several people have grown those. We're going to plant one here at the Arboretum this fall, but I haven't heard that that's been a problem. But you can imagine that there is some seeding because of how many fruit are being produced by that one tree. So I think it could become a problem, but Smoke tree and lilac have been very and great for insects in my dry yard. Hoping you have more of these in the sale. We will have all of those at the sale. I love Heptacodium. I have several of those in my own backyard, and they're blooming right now, and the pollinators are loving them. A variety of Heptacodium called Temple of Bloom is a little bit shorter form. Yes, it's not native, but it does offer flowers for pollinators, and they flock to those plants. Smoke tree is beautiful. I love a variety called Grace, and then the lilacs are historic for being around old farmsteads here in the state. I see that you're recording. How can we rewatch this and your previous presentations from the first? Like I said earlier, we are recording these, and we will make these available after the plant sale, just because of time's sake and getting those back and publishing those. So look for those the week or so after the plant sale, and we'll try to make those available to you. Notify people that they are either on our website or how they can link to those to the other presentations. So any other questions? If you think of something after we sign off tonight, feel free to email the Arboretum. Be happy to answer any questions. Like I said, a great resource, and one that I use here at the Arboretum, is that recommended trees of South Central Kansas from the Kansas Forestry Service. And it's been updated over the last couple of years to take into account some of the difficulties that individuals and people have had with pines, giving alternatives there. So that may be something that you want to look at as well. But if you don't have any other questions, I will sign off. Thanks everybody for participating, and hopefully you come to the sale next week.